Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Research 411, a talk show focused on sharing best practices and trending research topics delivered by professional staff and prominent UT Dallas researchers from various disciplines. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research. I will moderate today's discussion. Joining me today to talk about rewiring the brain after injury is Dr. Seth Hays. Seth Hays received his Bachelor's of Science in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and his Ph.D. in Neuroscience from University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Dr. Hays is an associate professor in the Department of Bioengineering at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he is developing therapies for stroke and other neurological disorders. 3 of these therapies are now in clinical trials. Dr. Hays has authored over 50 peer-reviewed publications and was awarded the prestigious American Heart Association Robert G. Siekert New Investigator for Stroke Award in 2015. Dr. Hays, welcome.
Good morning, everyone.
Now, Dr. Hays, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my research is focused on using stimulation of the vagus nerve to promote changes in the brain. And this process is called neuroplasticity. And so the idea behind this is when we stimulate the vagus nerve, we get release of chemicals in the brain that are associated with these changes or plasticity. And when we think about plasticity, we think about learning. So what we try to do is to stimulate the vagus nerve to promote learning in the context of something like rehabilitation. So we stimulate the vagus nerve when a patient is doing stroke rehab or rehab for spinal cord injury, or like we'll talk about later, even rehab for other things that we associate with neurological disorders like PTSD, or potentially there's some applications here even for autism.
Thank you. Now, I understand that the name of your lab is Targeted Neuroplasticity Lab. And I teach yoga at UREC, University Recreation, and have read various research-related articles that support enhanced neuroplasticity for those that engage in physical exercise. What can you tell us about neuroplasticity, and can you speak to the benefits of exercise prior to or after a stroke or spinal cord injury?
Certainly. So yeah, promoting neuroplasticity is something that is typically, there are a lot of things that promote neuroplasticity. Many of them are things that we associate with being healthy, like exercise or eating right or sleeping. These are all associated with changes in neuroplasticity. And again, what we want from neuroplasticity is to promote learning. So certainly there are applications where, a patient would exercise either before or even exercise after a stroke, like with rehabilitation. And the idea with that is that you're promoting these changes in the brain. So there's lots of things that can drive these changes, and those are typically beneficial for patients.
Thank you, Dr. Hays. And is there any benefit to people in relation to exercise as far as a health component to prevent something like stroke?
Yeah, certainly there are a lot of neurological disorders where things that, again, typically we think of as being healthy, including exercise, that are associated with lower incidence of these disorders. So one of the things there's been emerging research on lately is that exercise is associated with a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease, and certainly because stroke is a cardiovascular event. So patients who tend to exercise more tend to have fewer strokes. So there is a protective component for exercise, but not only for stroke but many other neurological disorders as well.
And if someone were to, engage in eating right and taking care of themselves and exercising regularly, and then were to still have a stroke, would there be a different result as in relationship to somebody who did not exercise and did not eat healthy?
That's a complicated question, but probably I would say, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, but my presumption would be from the existing evidence that generally, if you're doing things that are associated with better health, you're going to have better outcomes after a neurological event like a stroke.
Thank you. Now, the vagus nerve, can you tell us where it's located, and can you explain the primary role of the vagus nerve, please?
Certainly, yeah. So the vagus nerve is a nerve that, well, the vagus nerve runs all over your body. Vagus means wandering in Latin, and so the vagus nerve, what we typically think about when you're learning about the vagus nerve in the anatomy class, you'll learn that it projects down, it goes from your brainstem, that's sort of at the base of your neck, all the way down into your viscera or in your chest and below, and it innervates a lot of our internal organs. So your stomach, your lungs. Many things receive projections from the vagus nerve, and they send projections back to the brain through the vagus nerve. So this is proposed to be a way that we can sense what's going on in our viscera or in our guts. And so the vagus nerve has some really interesting applications. One of the early applications of the vagus nerve that was dependent on this projection of the vagus nerve to the stomach is that people who had gastric ulcers would undergo a vagotomy, or simply a cut of the vagus nerve that would reduce acid secretion in the stomach, and that provided some relief. So that was a pretty barbaric way to get at this, but the vagus nerve has roles in control of a lot of our guts. But what we're focused on in my research is actually the opposite way that information flows through the vagus nerve. So not down from your brain telling your organs what to do, but rather your organs sending information back up to your brain. So we get a lot of sensory information, afferent information that's passing from our organs up to our brain, and that can modulate changes in our brain. So what we do is we stimulate the vagus nerve, the cervical part of the vagus nerve, which is in your neck. We stimulate there, and that activates these axons, these neurons that go up to your brain, and that drives release of these neuromodulators. And then those neuromodulators promote neuroplasticity, like we talked about before.
Excellent. Yes, we've kind of come full circle. So the vagus nerve is directly related to that mind, heart, gut feeling that people have when encountering certain situations in their life. I know you spoke a little bit of the history of the research in your example that you shared, but can you tell us a little bit more about the history of vagus nerve and vagus nerve stimulation?
Certainly. And so, the mind, heart, gut connection is an interesting one, right? So we can all stimulate our vagus nerve right now if we take a really deep breath. So when you breathe in, your lungs stretch. And that information on your lung stretch is conveyed by your vagus nerve up to your brain. And the idea is to keep your lungs from stretching too much. So if you're doing yoga or something and you're engaged in a breathing exercise or even meditation, you're stimulating your vagus nerve in a very physiological way. By doing this deep breathing that's stretching your lungs, that's going to activate your vagus nerve. So where the really scientific, interest in this comes from is that someone observed, this is quite some time ago now, that you get changes in the EEG when you stimulate the vagus nerve. And so these changes in the EEG, we won't get into too much of the details here, but basically you have a lot of neurons in your brain, and all these neurons can fire what are called action potentials, where the neurons become active. And speaking very simply, if too many neurons become active at once, that's what we think about with epilepsy or seizures. And so what was observed was that when you stimulate the vagus nerve, you could desynchronize some of the firing of these neurons. So rather than have them firing at once, you could get them to fire out of phase with one another. And so somebody thought, well, maybe that would help when we get too much firing in phase, like with epilepsy. So this was originally developed as a therapy, vagus nerve stimulation, electrical stimulation of vagus nerve at least, was developed as a therapy for epilepsy, based on this idea that you could drive these changes in the brain. And so that really served as an early precursor to my work, which now looks at not exactly this desensitization or desynchronization of neurons in the brain, but really what are the actions of stimulating the vagus nerve on the brain? And can we use those actions to then do something therapeutic?
Perfect. So stress is something that impacts our lives. And sometimes with too much stress, then we have changes in the brain. And our sympathetic nervous system is activated, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so how can we activate the parasympathetic nervous system?
Yeah, so the sympathetic nervous system is, and this is the mnemonic device that students hear when they get taught this, is that the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. So this is when somebody would sympathize with something that's happening to you, like you saw a snake, that activates your fight or flight response. It drives our pulse up. It makes our pupils dilate. It has this whole body response that prepares us to run from something or, to fight or to flee, right? So the opposite of that, sort of the yin to that yang, is the parasympathetic response. And so this is our rest and digest response. And predominantly what we think about the vagus nerve doing is controlling this rest or digest response. So as a result of that, there's been a lot of interest in using the vagus nerve to reduce stress or reduce, sort of another manifestation of stress, which we would think of as anxiety. And this was just observed in patients who were receiving VNS, that they reported lower levels of anxiety. And this is consistent with this idea I was mentioning before, like when you stretch your lungs, when you do this deep breathing and meditation, you activate the vagus nerve. Activating the vagus nerve would be associated with this parasympathetic or rest and digest response. And that itself is sort of associated with reductions in anxiety. So there's a lot of interest actually in using the vagus nerve to drive down these anxious responses or these stress responses.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hays. So with stress being a risk factor for stroke, what kind of rehabilitation do you couple with VNS to ward off another stroke?
Well, so we actually don't know if VNS is going to reduce later incidence for stroke, but certainly reducing stress levels generally is good. Where we really see this being more useful is when we use VNS for PTSD. Certainly anxiety is one of the symptoms that's often comorbid with PTSD. And so we might find that for patients who are receiving rehabilitation combined with VNS for PTSD, that they might get a secondary benefit, which is this VNS-dependent reduction in anxiety.
Thank you. Now, what other strategies or techniques do you employ when using vagus nerve stimulation to assist with the rewiring of the neurons in the brain, or does it in fact work independently?
That's a great question. And so this is a really important point about how we employ vagus nerve stimulation. So vagus nerve stimulation itself, all it is doing is driving release of these neuromodulators in the brain. So what you really need in order to learn is not just neuromodulators, but you also need something that you are learning, right? And so the magic here that we get from our therapy is the coupling of vagus nerve stimulation with some kind of training or some kind of rehabilitative training. So if we did just vagus nerve stimulation and you didn't do rehabilitation, you wouldn't get any benefits. So it's the combination of these two things that's really important. So the way we think about this is, let's say that a patient is doing rehab for, they've had a stroke and they're doing just sort of general rehabilitation that you'd expect. So they're reaching forward and flipping over cards. This is a common rehabilitative task. And so there are some commands that your brain is sending to your muscles that are controlling your hand to flip over those cards. After a stroke, of course, some of those circuits are going to be damaged and you're going to need to use a different way. But we can typically work with circuits that we've got left to try to produce some movement to flip over these cards. What the VNS is doing is when we stimulate the vagus nerve, we're releasing these chemicals when these neurons that are controlling your hand are active, and that's promoting changes in those active circuits. So it's really important that you're doing some kind of rehab combined with this VNS in order to get the benefits.
That makes sense. Now, can you speak to the timing? Is it important to do this immediately following a stroke, or does it matter?
That's a great question. So I'll try to avoid going too far down the science rabbit hole on this, but this is really important. This is also really important, and I'll talk about timing in two different ways here. So the first is what we normally think about, sort of how soon after the stroke does the therapy have to be delivered. And what we've seen from our studies in animals and also studies in humans is that it's not important that the therapy be delivered shortly after the stroke. So for a lot of stroke therapies, this is really important, but typically those are the ones that are that are focused on preserving cells after the stroke. So a stroke is when a clot gets stuck in a vessel in your brain. So if you can dissolve that clot rapidly, like with something like TPA, which is the first line treatment that a patient would get for a stroke, that would really help to prevent brain damage from happening. But our therapy works on using what you've got left after the brain damage has happened. So the important part about that is that it doesn't seem to matter how long it's been since you've had your injury. VNS is just as effective in patients who have had an injury within the last couple of months as it is in patients who've had an injury over 10 years ago. So the second aspect of timing relates to the fact that I was mentioning before, you have to do rehab and you have to do VNS. Well, how close do those have to be in time? So like if you're flipping over these cards, can you wait seconds, minutes, hours after you finish the rehab or prior to the rehab to give the VNS. What we found is that it really needs to be delivered within a few seconds of when those neurons are active. And this is consistent with how we think it works. What VNS is doing is it's promoting plasticity in those circuits that were just active. And this is consistent with normal learning. When you're trying to learn how to shoot a free throw, you know, the neurons that move your arm to shoot the basketball, those are active. If you make it, you get this reinforcement from having made it that sort of stamps in, and you know, that's how you build up the strengthening between those connections, is how you progressively get better at shooting baskets. The same is true here. Patients are doing rehab and we're providing an extra boost, an extra reinforcement with vagus nerve stimulation. So it actually needs to come shortly, or at best, you know, directly during the therapy.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Hays, do you have the device with you? Can you show the device or explain, you know, what it looks like to the audience, please?
I would be more than happy to. And so let me start off saying that the way that VNS has been used previously is the VNS has been around. It's been FDA approved since 1995. It was used for a different. It was used in a different way then. This was basically something called semi-continuous cycling VNS, where VNS is on for 30 seconds and then off for 5 minutes, 24 hours a day through the rest of your life. And that was the way it was delivered for epilepsy. When we use vagus nerve stimulation, we stimulate for only a half second for each pulse, and it only happens during rehab. So we're delivering very short pulses of stimulation that are in a pretty constricted time during the day. That's typically done with a device that kind of looks like a pacemaker. So to date, what patients have gotten is, you know, it's an implant that's probably the size of, imagine the bottom of a can or something. It's about that size and maybe a little over between 1/2 and 1/4 of an inch thick. That gets implanted under a clavicle here. So like here, that's the battery for the device and the circuits that control the device. Then a lead gets implanted, so a little electrode, a wire electrode gets implanted, runs up under the skin, and gets implanted to the vagus nerve in the neck. So that's been the conventional way to do this. That's, you know, it's pretty well tolerated. Patients have gotten this for a long time. 100,000 people have had these implants. So it's a pretty effective way to do it. But as with many medical devices, once something gets approved, it becomes challenging to make improvements on that because it's very costly and you don't know whether it's going to pay off. So, you know, being at the university, this has given us a lot of flexibility to rethink how is the best way to do vagus nerve stimulation. And so in this effort led by Rob Redeker and some other individuals here at Texas Biomedical Device Center, we've been really focused on seeing if we can develop a next generation device to stimulate the vagus nerve. So that's a long way to say, I have our next generation device here, and I'll try to hold it up to my camera and see if I can make this happen. I don't know if you guys can see that.
Yes,
so
we sure
it's
can.
quite small. It's about the size of a chiclet. So you know, if you can imagine something that's 1/2 inch in the size of a Coke can, you'd rather have this small one. This device actually goes directly on the nerve. So there's no leads that are tunneled up. This gets implanted right on the nerve. And the way that this is powered is like if you guys have a cell phone that charges on a dock, like you don't plug it in, you just set it on the little pad and it charges. This uses that same technology. So basically when patients are getting rehab, they'll wear a band around their neck that aligns over this device that's implanted on the nerve. There's no battery, which has advantages that, you know, you don't need a surgery to get your battery replaced or anything like that. So this has some advantages that we're really hopeful about. And so this device is now just starting to be used in human trials.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information, and we're thrilled to see the device as well. You painted a clear picture of you know, how it works and how it looks. How about surgery though? I know that you said it is implanted. Now, is the surgery invasive? Does it take a lot of time?
This is a great question, and this is a really important. It's important to compare this to other things that are available, right? So with the traditional vagus nerve stimulation devices, like I mentioned, 100,000 people have had them. It's a surgery where it requires us basically an incision on the chest to implant the battery, and then another small incision to implant the leads in the neck. It takes some time, but it's pretty well tolerated, and it would generally be considered non-invasive. It would be considered, you know, it's not terribly invasive by comparison to something like deep brain stimulation or something where it's a pretty major surgery. So what we've found so far is in implanting our device, it requires just a single incision on the neck. And it seeming like it takes surgeons in the order of 20 to 30 minutes to do the implantation. Then the skin gets basically, the skin just gets joined together and glued on top. So there are no sutures, there are no visible sutures. So ultimately we view this surgery as fairly minimally invasive. And again, patients have, so far, the people who have gotten this implanted have not had any significant problems related to the surgery.
Perfect.
I should mention too that there are some ways to stimulate the vagus nerve non-invasively, or at least there are some systems that may be able to stimulate the vagus nerve non-invasively. So this is a really rapidly emerging area of research, and I think we would all agree that if we could avoid doing a surgery, that would be in the patient's best interest. So we would love to be able to leverage these non-invasive devices. I think, though, the research just doesn't really exist yet to suggest that these are stimulating the vagus nerve in the way that you need in order to get therapeutic benefits for the way we're using them. So there are systems that stimulate a branch of the vagus nerve that innervates the ear, and there are ones that just sit directly outside the neck. But I would say that the jury is still out on whether those activate the nerve, and certainly we don't have a good understanding if those activate the nerve reliably and in the way that we need it to be activated. So it's something that is certainly, that's on the horizon. That's something I'm actually really excited about, is perhaps we can, with some of this technology, as this technology evolves, we'll be able to get a non-invasive version of this. But for now, our best option for patients to ensure that we're reliably stimulating the nerve and can deliver the best therapy to them is this implanted version.
Thank you, Dr. Hays. And I understand that you have 3 clinical trials currently underway. VNS coupled with rehabilitation, including patients with stroke or spinal cord injury. Can you share the specificity of the trials and your perceived outcomes or data to date, please?
Yes, certainly. I'd be happy to. I'm very excited about these, as you might imagine. So this is kind of the culmination of the lab work that I've been involved in, and people at Texas Biomedical Device Center, my collaborators here, students, postdocs, et cetera, at Texas Biomedical Device Center have been working on for quite some time. So we've got 3 trials ongoing right now, as you mentioned, and so the first of these is using vagus nerve stimulation paired with rehabilitation in patients with spinal cord injury. So spinal cord injury can be a really devastating disorder. This is, of course, where the spinal cord gets damaged in response typically to some trauma, and that disrupts communication from the brain to your muscles. And so what we are doing, and we've looked at this extensively in our animal models, is we can promote connections from the brain to these muscles after the spinal cord injury. We can basically rewire the way these neurons are connected, and that promotes recovery. So we're now testing this in humans. This study has just begun. There are a small number of patients who have begun, but ultimately the way this is going to work is patients are going to get rehabilitation with or without VNS over the course of several weeks. And then what we're going to measure is, did we change the ability to use their hand that was impaired by the spinal cord injury? So we're going to measure things like how much force can they, how hard can they squeeze, how many degrees can they deviate their wrist, as well as sort of normal clinical measures, which are somewhat more descriptive. So imagine a scale from 0 to 50 that says, you scored a 25. We'd like to see those scores move up on these clinical measures as well. The stroke study is much the same, with the exception of course, it's in stroke patients instead of spinal cord patients, but the idea is the same. There's damage to the brain that disrupts connectivity from our motor networks in our brain to our muscles, and VNS can, when paired with rehabilitation, rewire those neurons that control the muscles. So that's a similar design. Patients get several weeks of rehabilitation with or without VNS, and then we observe whether we have improved these metrics of movement like force, angle, range of motion, etc., as well as these clinical measures. Our third study is a little bit different, but it's based on kind of the same concept, and I'll take a brief diversion here to explain it. So the idea behind vagus nerve stimulation paired with some sort of therapy is that what VNS is doing is releasing these neuromodulators and promoting changes in the brain. And those changes in the brain follow what the patients get with rehab, and they are typically beneficial. So the idea is that if we can give a rehab that would drive adaptive or beneficial brain changes, we can enhance that by delivering that with vagus nerve stimulation. So based on this, we thought, what if we tried this with something that's even more different? So in patients with PTSD, they undergo a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. And what a lot of research in animals has shown is that what you need is, to extinguish these aberrant fears, is you need to relearn that the associations are no longer fearful. So this is obviously a simplified version of what PTSD is, but the concept is the same. So what we're doing in this third study is we're enrolling patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they are undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is a fairly standard intervention, but during this cognitive behavioral therapy, we're delivering stimulation of the vagus nerve to promote those changes that are occurring in these patients' brain that are associated with relearning that these cues, related to their trauma are no longer fearful. So this is just beginning. Again, with all of these studies, these are very, very much in their infancy. I would love to give you information on how they're going, but we simply haven't even made it far enough in these studies to get there yet. But these kicked off just in the last month or so. So we're really excited to be producing, to be able to produce this data over the next couple months. So I should have mentioned in that study, what we're going to do is observe PTSD symptoms in these individuals and see if when they receive vagus nerve stimulation with this therapy, if we're able to reduce those symptoms that are associated with PTSD.
Thank you so much. I do have two questions from the audience, and that first question is, I've seen YouTube videos that show stretches that are said to activate the vagus and therefore the parasympathetic system. To your knowledge, do these kinds of stretches work?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two different ways. For the stretches, yeah, I mean, I think, certainly anything that's getting you up and moving is probably beneficial to your health. But more to the point about the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, I think the answer is yes. When you do these things, so just like the deep breathing, right? So there are things you can do that affect your physiology that ultimately produce activation of this parasympathetic nervous system. If you're getting stressed before, if you're going to go out on stage and give, come on a Research 411 talk show and you're getting stressed about it, what you would do is take some deep breaths and that'll calm you down. So yes, you can certainly activate your parasympathetic nervous system with a variety of different physiological stimuli. So those can be anything from breathing to probably stretching. Yoga is associated with this, to even things like plunging into cold water, which is not one we would normally do. But there are a lot of things that can activate your vagus nerve and produce this parasympathetic response. Could we use those therapeutically? That's a different question, I think. I think generally activation of the parasympathetic nervous system is generally net good, but could we do that in combination with rehab? That might be tricky, again, because we need this really close sort of seconds timing with this neural activity and our activation of the vagus nerve. So for our purposes, electrical stimulation is the best way to do this. But yeah, I certainly agree that there are other ways to engage the parasympathetic nervous system that likely act through stimulation of the vagus nerve.
Thank you for weighing in on that question. Another very short but quick question that I'd like to ask you is implantation. So implantation on a nerve may sound daunting or scary to some of the audience members. Can you tell us how risky it is?
That's a great question, and I'll give you kind of two perspectives on that. For our device, we have done extensive testing to make sure that it is as safe as possible. We've gone to the highest standards that are required by the FDA to ensure that this is going to be as safe as possible for patients. However, we don't have that much experience with our device in humans. We've done all of the testing you could possibly imagine in animals, again, to make sure it's safe. And we absolutely believe that it is going to be safe. And that's one of the reasons it received approval by the FDA. But we don't have direct data on that because we just don't have, we've only had a few people who have had this and they've only had it for a few weeks. However, compared, vagus nerve stimulation, as I mentioned before, other people have gotten these implants on their nerve. 100,000 people have gotten vagus nerve stimulation implants. And generally speaking, by comparison to other therapies, it is extremely well tolerated and quite low risk. And so, we're targeting these things, we always do a risk benefit ratio here. So we think the device is very safe. And also this is being used in patients who have pretty significant disabilities. So not only do we believe it's going to be safe, but we're also targeting those who stand to gain the most from it. So as far as placing devices on the nerve, though, that's not terribly, uncommon, actually. This has been used for several decades. And in fact, stimulating the spinal cord is one of the more common neurological sort of, one of the successes of biomedical engineering as it relates to neuroscience is these spinal cord stimulators. And these are implanted all the time. You probably know somebody who has a spinal cord stimulator implant for to control pain. And so this is actually a relatively common and safe procedure to interface with the nervous system in this way.
Alrighty, we have two other questions in from the audience. The first one is along the lines of using VNS paired with CBT for PTSD. Can it also be applied to phobias?
I love that question. That is an excellent question, and the short answer is I really hope so, but we don't know yet. So phobias, basically, just to back up a little bit, the person who asked the question seems to know this, but when people get CBT for phobias, basically what you get is you get a form of desensitization. So let's say you're scared of spiders. You would go in, and I'm ahead of my skis a little bit here because again, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but the way I understand this is you would talk about spiders at first. You'd start about imagining a spider, right? And it would be worse to kind of make your skin crawl. But the idea is that if you did that for a long time, and then maybe you handled a plastic spider, and then maybe you handled an actual spider, over this time, you would be becoming more and more desensitized to it. So hopefully, this is actually pretty congruent to how we did these studies in the animals, was to basically desensitize them from something that they were conditioned to be afraid of. And so the way you would do this is when the patient is doing this desensitization therapy, we pair that with vagus nerve stimulation. Hopefully that would promote this desensitization process in the brain, and that actually might really benefit patients with phobias. So we're not there yet. There's a lot of legwork to be done before that, but absolutely that is a possibility, and it kind of fits with our understanding of how VNS works.
Is it safe to say that the possibilities of using VNS are unlimited?
I always hesitate to say stuff like that, but I think we're really just pushing the frontiers of what we're able to do with this. So we focus mostly on motor function because it's, my lab has, because it's the, sort of the most boneheaded and easiest way to get into this. It's the thing we understand the best from a neuroscience perspective. But now we're starting to apply this with sensory-based therapies and even with cognitive-based therapies. So there's potential for this. And what I would say is this. Vagus nerve stimulation on its own, in its own right, is not necessarily this amazing technology, but applying it with rehab really is a groundbreaking way to do this. So if there's a good rehab for it, there's a good chance that VNS might be able to help basically boost the effects of that rehab.
Right. Can you also speak to the potential for VNS to help individuals who suffer from addiction? Rewiring the brain in that fashion might be very beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a really, really important way to be able to apply this therapy. And I think the thought would be the same. You would want to expose someone to a therapy that would desensitize them, hopefully. This is fairly common. Cognitive behavioral therapies for this, and a patient who's addicted to some substance would undergo a desensitization or cognitive behavioral therapy, and that could be paired with VNS. There is some early work in animals, actually, from a researcher in the neuroscience department at UTD that has shown that there's some promise for this. But this is always complicated. Moving studies forward from animals to humans with stroke is pretty straightforward because we can be sure that they've had what the animals experience is similar to what humans experience with the stroke. However, this is pretty different when we get to these things like PTSD and drug addiction that are really complicated disorders. However, I do think there is a lot of promise there, and I'm really, really hopeful that we continue to follow up on that work because I think that's something that would be hugely impactful and has real potential.
Thank you, Dr. Hays. And another question from the audience. Does VNS stimulate efferent and afferent fibers or both?
Yeah, this is a great question. So afferent fibers, defined for our purposes, are ones that project, they're neurons that project up to the brain through the vagus nerve, and efferent fibers are ones that project from the brain and send information out through the vagus nerve. When we stimulate electrically, we activate both efferent and efferent fibers, so both directions. And that's actually one of the things that's really important for VNS because the ascending, the afferent projections, give us this neuroplasticity enhancing effect, and the efferent projections, to the extent that we understand it, give us the anxiety reducing effect of VNS. So we get this double benefit by stimulating and getting this sort of bidirectional activation of these fibers.
Thank you. And I want to take a moment to tell the audience that our program will end shortly, but we are happy to entertain any additional questions that you may have. And Dr. Hays, we really have went through so many questions and you've shared so much information with us. I think that there was one other item we may have wanted to discuss, and it was related to your next gen miniature device. used to stimulate the nerve? And can you speak to the computer-based telerehabilitation games that you use in conjunction with that next-gen device?
Absolutely. And so I think this is a really important part about thinking about how we actually take this from the university or from the lab environment and actually be able to deliver it to patients who need it. And so if the magic of vagus nerve stimulation therapy comes from taking VNS and combining it with rehabilitation, the rehabilitation is critically important. And how do you get rehab? Well, you go to the office of a therapist and they work with you. And that's a really important step, right? It's important not only for our therapy, but it's something that's beneficial for patients. What's become, one thing that COVID has done is made it very clear that telerehabilitation, or kind of like rehab, like over Teams or something like this, is a pretty good way to deliver benefits to some patients. So what we'd like to be able to do would be to send patients home with devices that can measure their movements, and they would do telerehabilitation. Maybe it's a video game based, like a Wii sort of thing, where they're playing some video game with these devices. And that would then trigger stimulation of the vagus nerve. So they'd wear this band, they would be at home playing these games or working with a therapist over Teams, and that would be triggering the stimulation. That would be really helpful, because this means if patients could do this at home and at their own pace, they could get much, much, much more therapy than they would be able to get working in office with a therapist, at least plausibly. So, this delivery and thinking about how can we deliver this to patients in their homes is a really important step. And I think, the pandemic has really pushed us forward on this. And so now we've made real progress, and that's designed into the study in patients who are going to get stroke, in the stroke study, in patients who are going to get rehab paired with VNS. They're actually going to take these devices, these rehab devices home, and use them at home in addition to the in-office visits.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Hays. We have a 3-part question from the audience.
Okay.
How long will the clinical trials last? When would the device hit the market? And once in the market, would physicians be the ones prescribing to their patients?
All great questions. So how long will the clinical trials last? These clinical trials that we're doing will probably occur over the course of about 2 to 3 years. Hopefully we'll be able to accelerate that, but that's about what we'd expect. Maybe 1 year to 3 years, I should say, hedging a little bit. So the PTSD trial is a phase 1 trial. So after we do that, we'll need to do a phase 2 trial. So the phase 1 trial just asks, is this safe and can you deliver it to patients? At the end of that, we would need to do a phase 2, which says how big of an effect can you get? And then a phase 3, which is a pivotal trial, which is in many more patients. And the question there is, did your therapy work as you thought it would? Did it actually give patients benefits? So that the phase 3 is really important. And so we're probably, 5 to 8 years out from having our answer, in best case scenario, from having our answer for PTSD. The SCI and spinal cord or strokes trials are this sort of combined phase 1, phase 2 trials. So we're a little bit closer on those. But I want to say that VNS using the conventional device, the study that was done using not our miniaturized device here, which is what all our trials are using, but this trial that spun out of a company that spun out of UTD that did this original work with the conventional device, their phase 3 study just finished and was just published about a week ago in The Lancet, which is a leading medical journal. And so this sets it up to be the first device-based therapy for chronic stroke. So that actually could be on the market in, months to year, probably months-ish by the time they need to do some interaction with the FDA, but that could be achievable in relatively short order. We're hopeful that we're going to be able to accelerate these for stroke and SCI and deliver these to patients in the next 5 years. But PTSD is probably going to be a little bit longer timeline than that. So that answers hopefully those first 2 questions. And then the second one is, will patients or physicians be the ones prescribing it? To my understanding, yes, this is how this would work. You visit someone who's giving you care, and they would provide you, a prescription for this, and that would ultimately schedule you for the surgery, and then you'd receive the rehab after that.
Thank you, Dr. Hays. If the audience members need this type or would like to participate in this type of research, who can they contact? Who can they reach out to? Or if they want to share this information with a friend or family member who is suffering from a stroke or a spinal cord injury, how can they become more involved?
That's a great question. So we would be thrilled if you guys, if you know people who would be interested in the clinical trials, we would be absolutely thrilled to, to talk more, give them more information about it. And so the best way to get this information is to look up the Texas Biomedical Device Center. I believe there's a link to that on the flyer that went out for this. But if you just Google Texas Biomedical Device Center, you will find it. It's part of UT Dallas. And this is a really, the Texas Biomedical Device Center is several faculty in both neuroscience and bioengineering. And we're the ones who have been developing this therapy. So we have a web page. You can find all the information on the animal studies, the research, and the human trials there. And that would be the best jumping off point.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and type that into the chat right now.
Perfect.
And that way, any audience members who are interested can go ahead and visit that Texas Biomedical Device Center webpage. All right. Well, I think that we are coming to the close of our show. Dr. Griffith, thank you for being on our program today to share valuable information with our community. Interested in attending this or another Office of Research event, please visit research.utdallas.edu. Thank you.